Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about cognitive development, I want to look at two other theorists, or one other theorist and a group really. But as I had mentioned before, is that what you see in this diagram is something we refer to as conservation. And a little girl is presented with um, two glasses. They hold exactly the same volume of milk. The person takes that glass, puts it in a taller one, and she's asked which has more milk. And of course, she looks at it and says, this taller one has more milk. And that's a classic example of conservation of mass or volume, if you want to put it that way. And that's one of the key characteristics of concrete operations, and that's one of the things that you will need to know to be able to identify each of these different stages. So stage one in Piaget's approach is sensory motor, birth to 2 years of age. About 8 months, the characteristic component of that is called object permanence. About 6 to 7, we go into the pre-operational stage, and we mentioned egocentricity, the lack of a theory of mind. Concrete operations, they comprehend the principle of conservation, which I have on the screen here. They think logically about concrete events. They grasp concrete analogies, and they comprehend mathematical transformations. Somewhere around the age of 12, reasoning expands then from the purely concrete to more abstract, and I mentioned hypothesizing. Now, one of the theorists that is getting more and more attention today is a guy by the name of Lev Vygotsky. And actually, he was a relatively young guy when he died. He was in his mid-40s when he died. But one of his main concepts that was probably the most profound was the idea that children are, in a sense, mentored through life by adults, and their approach really matters in terms of their development. And so he looked at primarily, in a sense, the social environment of the child's development. And so that was his major emphasis. Now, with that, one of the key concepts that's part of understanding Vygotsky is something that we talk about, and I think I've mentioned it in another concept, is the idea of scaffolding. Now, when you think of that, think about painters, for example, or people that are building a building with bricks. What you see is a series of steps, if you will, that are scaffolds that allow the person to move higher and higher up the wall as they're building the wall that's behind here. This scaffolding is what adults do as kids begin to grow, keeping it just ahead of their development, so they have to reach for it and move up to the next developmental level. And that's what scaffolding is all about, is the adult has to be very intentional in what they do in helping the kid to develop, the child to develop more and more sophisticated skills in life and cognitive development. And that was a key emphasis. This has gotten worked in progressively into educational models in terms of what teachers do, in terms of teaching kids themselves and being sensitive to what their particular needs are. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is just, or at least give you an overview of, is the current state of modern research when it comes to development. And one of the key points in understanding that is that we, for a long time, we were very stuck on seeing kids from a Piagetian stage model, if you will. And so we never really looked at certain skills that emerged earlier, and that's what we're finding, is that there are some skills that emerge earlier than the Piaget model would indicate. And because of that, then it's not, it is a stage, but it's also a continuous growth. And that we talked about earlier is one of the key kind of points of view within these stages, is that the stages are convenient markers in terms of development. But there is continuous growth within, which means that certain skills will intrude in those other stages that Jean Piaget oftentimes talked about. So the bottom line is, it's which you'll hear me talk about a lot, is it's a both and, not an either or. Either it's stages or it's continuous growth. The reality is that it's a both and. It's both stages and continuous growth within each stage that helps us to understand how kids actually develop.